Welcome to the Idea Pod, a podcast dedicated to exploring and interrogating professional, biomedical and applied ethics at the University of Leeds.
My name's Andy Curtin. I'm here today to talk with my colleague Jim Baxter about psychopaths and moral responsibility. So, Jim, nice to be here with you.
Thanks, Andy. Hi there.
Let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name's Jim Baxter. I work at the Idea Centre, and I work in a consultancy role. So lots of my work's with professional bodies and businesses and so on, doing consultancy and training on ethics and to a great extent on professional ethics. But while I've been in that role, I've also been doing my own research, which is not kind of directly related to that area of work, but I suppose sort of loosely in some ways. So I did my PhD starting in, when was it now? I guess starting about 2012 and going through till 2018. Part-time, and the topic that I was studying was psychopaths and moral responsibility. So whether we should hold psychopaths morally responsible for their actions or not. And then since having completed that PhD, I've published a book which was out late last year, on the same topic. And so I understand that psychopaths and responsibility is something that you have an interest in as well, kind of research, arising from your own research, right?
Yeah, I mean, who isn't interested in psychopaths, right? I'm also a lecturer at IDEA, and so my research, I did a PhD from 2014 to 2018, and that was on trust. So I'm just interested in what trust is. And I think one of the things that got me interested in that was the way trust interacts with moral phenomena and kind of changing the normative landscape, as they say. So when you trust people, you sort of morally expect more things from them.
Sure.
And throughout that research, I mean, I looked at a lot of philosophy, but the sort of most enriching and interesting stuff comes from literature in psychotherapy and developmental psychology. So I'm really interested in how underneath trust it seems like there's a lot of attachment sort of drives and systems going on. And so I'm interested in how psychopaths orientate themselves towards other people. Maybe there's some interesting stuff going on there with attachment, and that might influence questions of moral responsibility. I've not got a book, so you're kind of going to be the one to talk through some stuff in depth. But I might have some rough things that I want to throw in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. So maybe we should just start off with an overview of what exactly is the question that you're interested in, and why is it interesting, and why should it matter to anyone?
Well, the question basically is about how we should respond to psychopaths. So it's about kind of what attitudes should we have to psychopaths, how should we treat them, how should we respond to the way they behave and the way they act towards us. And it's kind of interesting, firstly, on an interpersonal level. So if you have a psychopath in your life, as many people do, how should you respond to the way they behave? Should you kind of remonstrate with them if they treat you badly? Should you kind of expect them to behave differently? Should you hold them accountable for the way they behave? Or should you just kind of treat them as a problem to be dealt with? So it's interesting on that kind of interpersonal level and difficult, but it's also interesting on a kind of societal level. So how should society treat psychopaths? Should it hold them criminally responsible? If a psychopath commits a crime, should they be subjected to punishment on the same kind of basis that a non-psychopath would? Or, again, should society treat them just as a difficult problem to be dealt with, but not someone who's responsible for their actions? So I think that's a really genuinely difficult question. And what's kind of interesting about it, just personally, is it's really not clear to me what my intuitions are on that. And from speaking to people about this topic, I've found that they, are similar. On a lot of these questions, you kind of have an intuition and then you want to work out whether it's justified or not. Like, to me, my intuitions on this topic are really genuinely pulled both ways. So on the one hand, sometimes if you look at the problem from a certain angle, you sort of think psychopaths should be held accountable, but from another angle, it looks like maybe they shouldn't. And I think you can kind of bring out this difficulty, or one way of bringing out this difficulty is comparing psychopaths with other mental illnesses or mental conditions. So with many other mental conditions, it's fairly clear that they do at least diminish moral responsibility, or at least in some circumstances and for some actions and so on. So, for example, if you consider somebody who suffers from delusions, well, let's say somebody suffers from a delusion that they think another person is like possessed by a hostile alien who wants to kill them, and then they kind of hurt that person in what they think is self-defense. Well, it looks pretty clear that at least in that circumstance, their moral responsibility is at least diminished, if not entirely absent, because they are mistaken about the circumstances in which they're acting. They're mistaken about the kind of reasons they have for acting and so on. But it's not obvious that psychopaths are in a similar kind of predicament, right? Because they don't, at least, they don't classically suffer from delusions in the same kind of way. So they're not mistaken about what they're doing. They're not mistaken about, who the people are that they're interacting with and so on, or what their motivations are. But there does seem to be something important missing in the way that psychopaths see the world and see other people, because their behaviour is kind of bizarre and inexplicable from the point of view of a non-psychopath in a way. So I was interested in trying to work out exactly what it is that's missing in psychopaths, and whether lacking that thing specifically is going to interfere with your moral responsibility or not.
So it's interesting. I just want to pick up on the fact that your approach, from when you started, it was very much sort of oriented towards, you might have a psychopath in your life who you need to deal with, and also society needs to do something with them. It seems like those are quite practical questions. But what you're doing is taking a philosophy, or taking a philosophical lens, and really identifying that there seems to be a puzzle. It seems like there's some sort of mistake that psychopaths maybe make, or at least in order to know how to treat them, it seems like we need to figure out what kind of mistake is going on. So this is maybe a bit of a loose question, but have you thought about that relation there between what exactly taking a philosophical approach to this puzzle is? How does that inform the maybe more practical concerns, like how we deal with them in society? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's right. So again, one of the things that attracted me to this question was, it just seems like one of those questions where philosophers are going to have something really, really useful to contribute, right? Because it's not a scientific question. So you can understand the science of psychopaths, and, you can understand all the available science about psychopaths from neurology and psychology and psychiatry and so on. And that's not going to tell you the answer of how you should treat them. So it is a very practical question, but it's something where it seems like all these questions about kind of responsiveness to reasons and so on, and reactive attitudes and all that kind of stuff that philosophers have gone into is going to be able to shed light on the question. So yeah, that was, it seemed like just a kind of, an obvious candidate for, applied philosophy to really be able to get to grips with the question. And obviously I'm not the first person to think that, there have been people who've written about psychopathy, but it's been, or at least when I started it had been kind of a few papers here and there really. And I thought, a really kind of sustained, in-depth look at the question was probably something that was going to be of value.
So someone to come along and do a thorough, rigorous job, tidy it up, sort it out.
That was the plan.
Yeah. How successful do you reckon you've been?
That's quite a difficult question to answer.
I guess it's early days, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I've only spent 10 years on it.
Yeah.
I don't know. So having come out at the other end, I'm fairly confident in the conclusions that I've reached. I do think I've reached the right conclusions, but I'm still in the predicament that I outlined before in terms of intuitions that, it's still just intuitively, it still seems like a mystery to me, I suppose. But I do think that having kind of thought in depth about all these different elements of the question, because I think it's a question that kind of ranges into a lot of different areas of philosophy, actually, emotions and moral development, as well as moral responsibility and like criminal responsibility and the law. So having kind of gone through all that, I've got an answer I'm happy with, but not everybody would agree with it.
Maybe they can buy your book to figure out whether they agree with it or not. It's a really interesting point, I think, that you just made, that it seems like through looking at what's going on with a psychopath, we can kind of learn something about the underlying mechanics of moral, the kind of moral engine as it's probably normally functioning. So in order to get to grips, we haven't really talked about what exactly is a psychopath. So maybe you could just go into some more detail on that question.
Sure. So, so that's a question that's not without controversy in its own right. So basically, there are a number of different rival diagnoses that people use, and there are different ways of describing the condition. And in fact, the kind of standard diagnosis is not psychopathy at all, but is antisocial personality disorder. So that's the one that you'll find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the standard manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness. But the diagnosis that I ended up using is the Robert Hare PCL psychopathy checklist diagnosis. So I don't want to go into too much detail about the reasons for the controversy, but basically the kind of central argument between Hare and people who support the PCL diagnosis and the people who support the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis is, well, the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis was kind of introduced because of worries about diagnosing underlying aspects of personality, and the thought that a diagnosis of mental illness should be done purely on the basis of observable phenomena. So if you look at the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis in the DSM, it's all kind of descriptions of behaviour, whereas in PCL, in Hare's checklist, it's descriptions of behaviour, but it's also underlying personality traits, including things like glibness, superficial charm, lack of empathy, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional responses across the board, those kinds of things, which the compilers of the DSM were a bit kind of suspicious of. But the reason I preferred the PCL is, well, firstly, because I'm interested in the personality, right? So, you know, if I'm going to be able to connect this to philosophical concerns about moral responsibility, I'm going to need to have an idea of what the underlying deficits or, you know, unusual aspects of personality are. So I want to be sure that I'm talking about people who have a specific kind of personality. And actually, I believe what you find when you apply the antisocial personality disorder is, you know, an awful lot of people end up being diagnosed as psychopaths under that description. So I believe the statistic is it's about 2 to 4% in the overall population would be diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder, which, I mean, I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem like a lot, but if it's 4%, then that's kind of 1 in 25 people, right? Which is quite a lot.
So when you go to the shop, there'll be a bunch of
basically, yeah, that seems to be the implication, yeah. And if you look at prison populations, which is quite key, it's even higher. I think it might even be something like 20%,
right?
Of people in prison would be diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder. And that's because, you know, you're looking at kind of behaviours which are going to be more common among people who end up in prison, I guess. Whereas if you apply the checklist, it's about 1% of the overall population. So you're talking about a much smaller group of people, and they're more tightly defined in terms of the underlying personality characteristics, which seemed like it was fairly important that I used that, really.
So I guess it's about finding something much more stable and consistent than just, because I guess behaviours can be exhibited for all kinds of reasons, and that might be just, you know, it might just be context, it might be people have difficult circumstances, but not everyone who, let's say, behaves antisocially as a result of those circumstances has these kind of underlying personality traits, which seem to be kind of really crucial for what you're interested in terms of the moral responsibility questions.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. Of course, when you're researching a topic like this, you do have to be aware that you're talking about real people. And kind of inevitably you're going to be making some generalizations, right? You're going to be saying psychopaths have these characteristics and they respond to reasons in these ways. And, you know, you have to be aware that you are talking about a real group of people. So I think you need at least to, so my approach was basically to say, well, the people I'm talking about are those who have these specific underlying personality aspects, and it's going to be an open question whether any given individual has exactly those elements of personality, right? So, which, you know, it means that the kind of there's a kind of gap there, and people who are better qualified than me are going to be actually diagnosing individuals. But when I say that psychopaths, spoiler alert, don't have moral responsibility, I'm talking about psychopaths who have a fairly well-defined cluster of psychological elements. So I should go back I was saying that I used the checklist. Basically, the way the checklist works is if you are find yourself in a kind of clinical setting, a psychiatrist who was looking to diagnose you would score you against 20 different aspects of personality. And you would either get 0, 1, or 2 on each of those. So you would get 0 if you didn't. Sorry, I said aspects of personality. Some of them are aspects of personality. Some of them are kind of descriptors of behaviour, as I said before. If you get 0 if you didn't exhibit those at all, you'd get 1 if you exhibited them to some extent or some of the time, and you'd get 2 if you kind of exhibited them all of the time or to a great extent. And then if you score, so you've obviously got a score out of 40. Overall, if you score more than 30, I think, you would be diagnosed as being a psychopath. So it's important to note that kind of most people would be very, very low on that. Most people would have sort of, less than 5, would be scored less than 5. So if you're getting 30, then you are kind of, you're exhibiting some fairly kind of out there behaviour and yeah. So yeah.
I was out of interest. Have you done the checklist yourself?
Well, you can't. So there is a kind of self-assessment version of it. No, right. I haven't done it. No.
Right.
Well, I think to be really a rigorous diagnosis is supposed to be done by a qualified psychiatrist. With access to all your case notes and stuff like that. Yeah. So I've not done it to myself.
Probably drilled into your history in a way that evades your own kind of defences and denial and all that sort of
Maybe
stuff.
we should do it now.
Yeah, let's get into that. I was going to say people should keep listening, even though you gave away the spoiler for your theory.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So one of the things that one of the questions that people wonder about is the rationality question. So we kind of talked about that a bit earlier, and whether the issue is that psychopaths are making some sort of mistake in how they're behaving. And I think there's a kind of history of certainly ethical thought when we're trying to pin down someone as being blameworthy, morally responsible for an action. There's a way in which you can only assign blame if they've made a mistake that they would accept by their own lights. So you have to appeal to the reasons that they would accept. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about the rationality question about and how that relates to psychopaths. So are they being irrational? Are they rational in some way?
So there have been various attempts by philosophers to demonstrate that psychopaths are irrational. First thing I should say is probably, it depends what you mean by irrational. So there's kind of, there's various different accounts of what it means to be rational. The most popular, basis for saying that psychopaths are irrational that I found in the philosophical literature was based on these experiments that were carried out by, a psychiatrist called, James Blair. Sorry, he's not a psychiatrist, he's a psychologist. And he carried out some really interesting experiments looking at psychopaths' ability to apply what's called the moral conventional distinction. So this is supposed to be a distinction that we all make between different kinds of moral infraction, I suppose. Different kinds of infraction that's either moral or conventional. The conventional ones are kind of more rule-based. They're more, they kind of depend on the word of an authority. Whereas the moral ones are supposed to depend more on the welfare of other people and the impact of the action on the welfare of other people. So, for example, I think one of the sort of case study vignettes that are used in these experiments is, kids talking in class in school is supposed to be a conventional infraction because it would be okay if the teacher had said it was okay, and it depends on a kind of rule that's been put in place. Whereas a child hitting another child is a moral infraction because it's wrong because it harms the other child, basically. So the Blair's experiments seem to suggest that psychopaths do have some trouble with making that distinction in a consistent way. So they couldn't or it appeared that they couldn't distinguish between moral and conventional infractions. Now, I think there's a couple of things to say about this experiment. So firstly, the original experiment was on quite a small group of people. I think sort of 15 psychopaths, and a similar number of non-psychopaths. And so it's quite a small empirical base, but still, there were interesting results coming out of it. But the other thing is that actually what Blair found in that experiment was not that psychopaths thought that all infractions were conventional, but actually that they thought that all infractions were moral. So they actually were more likely to call these things moral, even when other people would call them conventional. And Blair explained that by saying, well, they are incentivized to kind of show moral disapproval, because I think these were people in prison that he was doing the experiments with. So they would kind of overcompensate by expressing, a high degree of moral approval, even if they didn't feel it. But it's just kind of interesting that you had to bring in that extra hypothesis to explain what was going on there. So I think there is something interesting going on there. But it seems like it's quite a weak empirical base to draw very sweeping conclusions on. But some philosophers have kind of suggested that because, if psychopaths can't make that distinction, then basically they think that all infractions are conventional. So they just think that, lying or stealing or murder are just kind of against the rules, or they're wrong because powerful people say they're wrong, or something like that. So that might well be true. But it seems like, again, it's not obvious that there's a really clear kind of scientific result that you can use there. And also it seems to me that, from reading the literature, there does seem to be quite a lot of evidence that at least some psychopaths are able to talk quite kind of eloquently about moral questions, and in a way that, makes them seem as if they have as much moral understanding as anybody else does. So in one of Hare's books, there are some examples of conversations with psychopaths where they're just, they're talking about, so there's one where he says, well, what I'd really like to do is, just find somebody to have in my life and really help them, and, really kind of, give love to somebody and care for somebody, and that would really make my life more meaningful. And there's a kind of 5-minute kind of speech where he's saying all this stuff where you think, yeah, that sounds great. And then Hare reveals that this person kind of killed his parents or something like that, right. And in a way that obviously kind of calls into question the sincerity, but it doesn't call into question the understanding, or it's not obvious that it does. The fact that you're able to talk convincingly in that way suggests that at least on one level you understand the principles and rules and values that other people are working with, right? So it seems like there's at least some evidence that at least some psychopaths are able to understand moral principles and apply them, at least in theory, in the same way that non-psychopaths are. So it seemed to me that if you're going to base a conclusion about moral responsibility purely on psychopaths' ability to understand and apply moral principles, then, you might conclude that some of them have enough problems with doing that to conclude that they're irrational, but probably not all of them. And in any case, there might be something else that you could look at that would end up including those people, but also others who seem to be, better equipped to work with moral principles, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess it's a bit like the problem is with appealing to rationality, that where you get this class of individuals who can in a way look from the outside in at the moral game and kind of go, well, that looks kind of appealing. That seems to be enjoyed by these people who seem to understand it and grasp it. And I can kind of see what's going on. I can see the game that's being played.
Yeah.
But in a way, there's something missing about my ability to enter into it. So the question isn't, or the issue, it doesn't seem to be understanding in that ability to grasp and see what's happening. But is there something else there? So the majority, you said, maybe just don't care, or they aren't moved by it. Is that?
Yeah, so that seems to be the thing, doesn't it? So if you look at that example from the Hare book, it seems like what you've got there is somebody who understands morality but doesn't care about it.
Yeah.
Or maybe, to put it another way, doesn't think it applies to them, really.
Mm.
So they can see that there are these reasons that other people take to be important, and other people take to have real normative force in terms of their own behaviour and so on. But they don't genuinely take those things to apply to themselves. Maybe, they might say they do, but their behaviour reveals otherwise, right? So if somebody's saying all that stuff and then, they appear to have killed their parents without really feeling guilty about it, then it just looks like there's something quite important missing. And it seems to me that what's missing is it's that they don't really understand that other people matter. They might understand that other people think that other people matter, but they don't genuinely themselves take other people to matter. They don't actually see other people as having value. That's just something that they understand that other people think, but they don't genuinely think it themselves. And the question is whether that is a gap in understanding or not, or merely motivation. And it seems to me that it is a genuine gap in understanding. I think if you say that other people matter and then you're able to lie, steal, kill without compunction, then I think you're revealing that you don't actually understand that people matter.
End of part 1.